let's bring in Mike McIntyre from the Winnipeg Free Press for his weekly visit. Let's get right into it with the Heinola signing. He was in RFA. Did not play almost at all in the NHL last year. We knew about the injury. 2 years, $800,000. I mean, it seems like, listen, if he can come in and fulfill his potential in the Jet Blue Line, that is going to be a perfect example of one of those contracts you really need to have right now in the National Hockey League and get the most out of players on ELC or quote-unquote under team control. And listen, there's no other option right now.
No.
Ville Heinola is going to get a run as a Winnipeg Jet this year, and now it's just about coming out and proving that he can fulfill his potential in the bigs.
Yeah, he absolutely is getting a run as a Jet because, again, I think most people recognize this, that Ville Heinola will have to go on waivers this fall if the Jets were to try to send him to the Manitoba Moose. And a guy with his talent, with his pedigree, who's making $25,000 above the league minimum, which is what his contract is. We've already seen in this market Jonathan Kovacevic get claimed on waivers by the Montreal Canadiens. We saw Declan Chisholm get claimed on waivers last year by the Minnesota Wild. And no offense to either of those guys, but they're not Ville Heinola in terms of the upside, the potential, the pedigree. My point being that if the Jets were to put Ville Heinola on waivers at any point next season, there would be a lineup of teams putting in a claim. He probably wouldn't get past, the number 1 or 2 claimer on the list at that particular time. So he's going to be with the Jets next season, whether that's in a role as a top 6 guy, a regular, or a bubble guy, 6-7, bit of a job share like we've seen in the past happen sometimes around here. Obviously, that situation will play itself out. Injuries will be a big part of it. One thing, and you mentioned, Huss, that he didn't play in the NHL last year. Of course, that broken ankle in the last preseason game was a crusher for him. But the Jets, for all their injuries they had up front last year, it's remarkable how healthy they were on the blue line. They really were. And the only way even guys like Logan Stanley, got into the lineup were because they started healthy scratching like Nate Schmidt at times. And of course, look at a guy, Kyle Capobianco, who ended up being the AHL Defenseman of the Year, who had spent the entire previous season with the Jets. He never got a sniff of the NHL last year either because the Jets were so healthy. So, obviously the Jets would hope that continues next season. But what are the odds that an NHL team would go 2 straight years without, really a scratch on their defenseman? The only injury that happened on the blue line last year came to Brendan Dillon in what was that, game 4? I think it was game 4, right, in Denver with the cut hand. But so they were a picture of health. I fully expect we're going to see, what would be the over-under? I would say let's set it at 40 games, and I'll take the over that Ville Heinola will play more than 40 games, aka more than half the season next year. And you're right about his contract, Huss. If he could, there's a prime example for a guy that you hope could outperform that contract. And it goes back to, I think I mentioned this to you a few weeks ago, something Kelly McCrimmon said that really stuck with me, talking about how Vegas won the Stanley Cup and how hard it is to kind of keep that together in the current salary cap era. And he said that you need a number of players to outperform their contracts in order to win a cup. And so a guy like Ville Heinola, basically, this is like an entry-level deal because it's barely above the minimum. That's a really affordable bridge deal for the Jets and an important piece of business to get taken care of. They've only got 2 RFAs left. Simon Lundmark is one of them. I got to think that's probably in the top, drawer of Kevin Cheveldayoff right now, and they just haven't filed the paperwork. There's not going to be anything that's probably a league minimum deal for Simon Lundmark. Obviously, the big one is Cole Perfetti, and I suspect we'll get into that a bit more this week, Huss. Isn't it interesting to see Quinton Byfield sign that extension yesterday? I think last week you and I talked about the Anton Lundell extension, and I said, I wonder if that could be a potential model Well, now you can add Byfield to the list of a similar kind of age player on a trajectory that obviously the Kings have decided they don't want to bridge him. They're going to reward him, but it's a deal that, if Byfield continues the way he's going to, should age really, really well for Los Angeles.
Yeah, well, listen, we'll get to the Perfetti and Byfield comparisons in just a second, but before we move on from Ville, I'll actually, if I'm setting that line, I'm putting it above 40. I'm looking at, 50, 55, something like that, to actually be in the lineup. Obviously, injuries can skew that. But it does sort of look like, and tell me if this sounds familiar, a battle for the third pairing, left-hand defense position between Ville Heinola and Logan Stanley.
Yeah.
Is that a
Groundhog Day?
Now, we do have a new coach, and Scott Arniel with an entirely new coaching staff. So, I think there is a caveat. People often will just think and talk about these things as if it's just continuation from last year, which isn't the case, and it's important to note. But what do you make of that? The fact that, here we are again, both of these players drafted later on in the first round.
Yeah. They're
now both in identical situations with 2-year deals moving forward. I've often said that some internal competition is actually a really good thing for a team. And you hope it brings out the best in both. I would just say this. I think based on last year, and again, granted, different coach, but Arnie was certainly part of that in those rooms. The fact that it looked like Ville had made the team and was on that spot right at the beginning, I think that maybe gives him a leg up. At a certain point, they have to be able to see what this young man can do. He'll never be more prepared than he is right now. He's spent the time in the American Hockey League. He's had some tough setbacks. Now's the time to see what he can do. But I do wonder just about that. It really does break down right now. Unless something happens and you're playing a guy on the opposite side, you've got Colin Miller, Neil Pionk is still here. This probably looks like it's a 6-7 battle between the little guy and the big guy.
Yeah, I will say one thing Ville can do that, say, Logan Stanley, I don't believe he can do or has done is play that opposite side. Like Ville has played the right side with the Moose. But you're right. Here's the thing to me about Ville Heinola. You look at when he's played in the NHL, very few games, obviously, none last year. Usually it's where he's had a stretch of really strong play in the A, and then he's been called up, and then he gets a game or two, and then that's it. And I think, if you've watched his game in the NHL, it probably doesn't translate as well as it should, because this is a guy who probably knows that he only had a game or two to really show, and maybe he tried to do too much, the nerves. What he hasn't had, Huss, really is an extended period where he knew that, even if he made a mistake or something, that he had a bit of runway to work with. I think that changes this year, and I do think that should allow us to see probably the better potential of what this player can be at the NHL level. And, you look at the Jets and what did they have trouble at times doing last year? Transitioning out of their own end, moving the puck quickly and efficiently. What are things that Ville Heinola does really well? Those exact things. And, Logan Stanley has some attributes, but those aren't them. We're talking about two very different players here. It's not like it's two players that are kind of do the same thing and flip a coin. So depending on how Scott Arniel wants to construct his lineup, and maybe it'll have to do with, matchups, who they're playing. But I got to think that there's a place for Ville Heinola as an efficient puck mover and a really smooth skater and all the things we've seen him do. The other thing, Huss, he was quarterbacking the Moose power play. You look at the Jets now, Nate Schmidt's gone. And there was a guy when Nate Schmidt was in the lineup last year, he was often on that second pair. Often it was him and Pionk. I got to think there's a spot on the power play here as well. What's one of the things that the Jets, a real weakness last season? The power play. To me, and Logan Stanley's not going on the power play. So I got to think that that's another in for him as well.
Hey, just on that power play for a second.
Yeah.
I'll throw this out because I've been thinking about this more and more since the Miller signing.
Yeah.
there's a good chance that Ville Heinola and Colin Miller will be that third pairing. I could also see both of them being on the second power play.
Yeah.
I mean, I think Ville's a player that is probably best suited to somewhat quarterback it. But the one thing that this team has missed ever since Bufflin and Laine left town is a guy, exactly, with a guy with the cannon back there. And Miller is that guy. And honestly, I think if those players play together, it probably gives them a little bit more comfort with each other to potentially make that second unit a little bit more. And I've thought about that. I wouldn't rule out either of those guys potentially playing together, both on a pairing as well as on the second power play unit. Bring it back to Ville. I don't think there's any doubt. If you want to get the most out of this player and put him in an opportunity to succeed in an area that had been somewhat of an Achilles heel for a very good hockey team through the regular season last year, this is it. And, you know, if he can play in the teens when it comes to minutes at 5-on-5 and contribute on the power play, I mean, this is, you know, the potential for him to really hit the ground running. And I think, you know, have a path to really succeed and build on everything that he's done to get to this point and finally get this shot as an everyday NHLer, assuming that he's in the top 6 once the dust settles out of camp.
Yeah, an interesting note about his contract. It's a one-way, which means, you know, again, I don't expect he's playing in the AHL at all next year. But
it's a one-way by definition.
It is.
Because
but
if he's at on waivers, he's probably bye-bye.
Right. It is interesting. The number, Huss, came in below his qualifying offer. Like, he would have made more money on his qualifying offer. The problem is the qualifying offer was a two-way. And so, you know, that obviously explains why they did the deal that they did. But I must admit, I thought his number would come in closer to $1 million. So, you know, we're talking about nickel and diming here when it comes to the cap. And the Jets they're not cash strapped in the sense that they have to make sure every penny counts. But I thought that was, the number surprised me is what I'll say. It was a little lower than I thought, and great for the Jets. You know, Ville's now got 2 years, and the hope, obviously, from the Jets' perspective, is he's a regular over these next 2 seasons. And, you know, we'll look back at this contract and say, my goodness, that they had this guy at $800,000, like that, what a steal. And then he'll parlay that into something a lot more significant, you know, 2 summers from now. That would be the win-win for both the player and the team, and we'll see if he can do it.
Yeah, but as I said, he'll be a guy that will be getting a ton of attention come training camp and in the preseason, and I think earlier on. But, I mean, if he does anything close to what he was able to do last year, he'll earn a spot again. And all the fans of Philly will finally get a chance to see him get a nice run in.